in the area of collective bargaining. I was actually very intrigued by the different subject matters and the diverse and new subject matters that we're going to discuss. So we're going to start with Assaf Bondy from university, who's a postdoc at the University of California, Los Angeles. He'll be speaking about new actors as motors for industrial relations change, inter-actors conflict, and the reformation of central collective bargaining. So Assaf, why don't you take it from here for, as I said, 10 to 12 minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Paula. Let's see if I, if I manage to share the screen. All right. Do you see my screen now? Good. All right. So my work the work that I'll present today address the problem of precarious workers' representation in a changing labor relations. It emphasizes the roles of new actors like civil society organizations in improving the representation of precarious workers, their voice, and the enforcement of their rights, focusing on the nature of their interaction with traditional unions. While previous research analyzed the contributions of cooperation between traditional unions and new industrial relation actors for the representation of precarious workers in a context of decentralized labor relations, this work look into the corporatist context and the contributions of interactor conflict or competition. And I'll elaborate some more. Let's see, boom, yeah. Precarious workers are considered to be traditionally excluded from industrial relations or from incumbent union representation. They are usually the ethnic minorities, migrant workers, women, part-time workers, or those in the gig economy. These workers are considered to be hard to organize. These workers are considered hard to represent, and it's usually hard to improve their wages due to low associational or organizational power, if we use Eric Olin Wright's terms. In union heydays, or the golden age of industrial relations, this was passed with little regard. Moreover, unions' achievements were improving conditions all around the labor market, while some workers were left underrepresented. In the face of liberalization of traditional industrial relations and the associational or institutional weakening of unions, unions are increasingly recognized as very partial actors and sometimes found as less fitting to precarious workers' needs. In this process, new actors enter the scene to compensate for past exclusion and to improve the representation of precarious workers. Worker centers in the United States, different forms of civil society organization in the UK, as well as individual social activists or entrepreneurs, develop new repertoires of workers' representation. They mainly, again, focus on the excluded, the underrepresented precarious workers. In decentralized labor relations, a lot of research have been done to find independent activities of worker centers, for example, but also increasing trends of cooperation between unions and non-union new labor actors. Cooperation is seen to induce unions to accept intersectional organizing and representation, complementing unions' previous failures to represent precarious workers' interests. In centralized contexts, on the other hand, research showed increased attention of unions to precarious workers. But what is the origin and motives for this change of union strategies in the context of centralized labor relation or corporatism? In corporatist labor relations, unions' autonomous revitalization, as it is named in the literature, is still dominating the research on these transformations. Nonetheless, the rise of new labor actors in corporatist labor relation raise new questions on these processes and the interactions around gradual inclusion of precarious workers. My paper analyzes changes in the representation of precarious workers in the context of Israel-Palestine, characterized with traditionally corporatists and highly exclusionary industrial relations, in which I analyzed two cases or three sectors representing different forms of inter-actor conflicts. To understand the ways new actors complement the representation of precarious workers and transform labor relations. These two cases, again, analyzed three sectors where union representation was based on top-down and exclusionary nature. Sectoral bargaining was based on social partnership between centralized union and employers association to regulate labor conditions, but without established structure of representation or any enforcement of workers' rights. My first case analyzed the gradual individual inclusion of Palestinian construction workers. In order to understand the change, we need to understand that non-citizen Palestinian workers entered the Israeli labor market since the 1967 war and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip were officially excluded from union membership. And to be honest, they are de facto excluded till today. This structural harsh exclusion gave them no ability to use official union channels to file grievances, as the union had no incentive and neither ability to represent them. In turn, employers were undermining the sectoral labor regulation and the legally binding collective agreements, eroding significantly workers' wages and workers' rights. In the cleaning and security sector, which comprised my second case study, while the situation was very similar. While the union enjoyed the position of sectoral representation through social partnership with employers, the sector's workers coming from ethnic minorities were underrepresented by the union, creating an ethnic-based representation gap, which corresponded to labor market segmentations. Workers' underrepresentation combined with sectoral collective bargaining allowed the union to take part in collective agreements that established subcontracted employment relations and recurrent concession bargaining. Moreover, as happened in the construction sector, regulation without representation resulted in constant and widespread violations of labor regulations and the legally binding collective agreements. With institutional support to unions' centralized position and strategies, this situation passed almost unnoticed, creating a significant representation, or if you want, a legitimacy gap of union representation and labor regulation. But in the face of union weakening institutional power, this gap became more and more salient, leading new actors to enter the void, promoting juridification of workers' representation. In both cases, these were civil society organizations and entrepreneurial lawyers that promoted workers' representation through judicial pleas, as well as some lobbying, that were directed to enforce workers' rights, rights that were regulated again by sectoral collective agreements and legally binding extension decrees. Starting in the early 2000s, these judicial pleas, proven successful for individual workers, quickly multiplied to arrive a huge quantity of thousands of legal claims a year in the construction sector and dozens of class actions every year in the cleaning and security sectors. In so doing, these new actors promoted workers' voice, but also found to undermine traditional industrial relations foundation of central regulation and the position of unions in the labor market. Civil society organizations and lawyers actually competed with unions on workers' representation. But as the union did almost nothing in these domains, these new actors were easily winning on the arena of representation. The union lost its place, or at least partially, as a monopolist representative of the workers. Labor courts showed no flexibility in enforcing workers' rights on employers, conflicting with traditional collective labor relations and reducing the incentives for central collective bargaining. Facing a significant threat to its position and to collective labor relations as a whole, pushed unions to change strategies and incorporate workers' grievances in order to reform their traditional dominance through inclusive strategies. In the three sectors, the union established internal enforcement mechanisms anchored in new sectoral collective agreements in order to impose the primacy and favorability of collective labor relations and union representation over new actors and judicial deliberations, acting to exclude the new actors from workers' representation. This imposed representation was most certainly unwanted by workers who had no trust in the unions that neglected their rights and voice for decades. Nonetheless, it reinforced unions' institutional power as courts gradually recognized these new mechanisms of rights enforcement in sectoral collective bargaining as favorable over independent judicial pleas. Thus, they start to rebuild union legitimacy and vertical coordination in the sectoral labor relation in these two cases. These strategic changes significantly undermine the ability of new actors to represent precarious workers. I can elaborate on the differences between these two cases as they based on sectoral characteristics of the labor market, but due to time limitation, I will sum up in few crucial points. My work proposed that a new perspective on the roles of new actors in the representation of precarious workers and on the revitalization of union representation or the development of inclusive union strategies toward precarious workers. While in decentralized contexts, new actors are seen to complement unions' decline and fill the representation gap through independent or cooperative strategies, in a centralized corporatist context, we can find other interactions that are based on external challenges and competition or conflict, if you want, with new actors, between new actors and established unions. In the centralized corporatist context of Israel-Palestine, unions hold a monopolist dominance in labor regulation, which is based on traditional top-down legitimacy, partnership between unions and employers association, making new actors highly unfitting to the system. But with unions' decline, new actors are seen to rise in these contexts as well to complement the historic exclusive or exclusionary strategies of unions and reinforce the representation and rights of precarious workers. With the rise of new actors, the research finds no cooperation potential among actors, but another complementary interaction with competitive or conflictual nature. These competitive interactions, previously seen as negative for workers' interests, are found to improve workers' representation and their at least partial inclusion to traditional collective labor relations. Additionally, they reinforce the legitimacy of unions, pushing unions to adopt more inclusive strategies that reinforce also vertical coordination in industrial relations. This has to do with the development of inclusive solidarities by unions or their revitalization. Unions' changing strategies is seen here to develop not as an autonomous process based on unions' power, but as an interactive and conflictual process initiated by non-union initiatives. Finally, the paper reveals the pros and cons of interactor conflicts or competition in corporatist contexts. The competition increases inclusion of previously excluded workers, though excluding representative actors, representative new actors from workers' representation, keeping the change for them very partial as it reproduces the structural biases or problems in traditional industrial relation. Thank you very much. Looking forward for the discussion.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that. It was interesting, and I know that we'll also find the next paper by Ting Zhang to be worthwhile. She is talking about the connected but still fragmented, the development of inter-union communication network on social media. Ting is an assistant professor at Merrimack College, which is a liberal arts college in Massachusetts. She came from University of Toronto, is that correct? Okay, good, I remembered that for a few minutes. Okay, now I've got to know Ting and you will hear her research too. Thank you, go ahead.
Like always, and I forgot to unmute myself. So thank you for participating in this session. It is a great honor to present at this session as well. And I want to start this conversation by giving you the spoiler of my research. So basically, if you see the title and you see what I try to talk about, and I already see some of the participants, and they, like me, are the Twits, and we use social media a lot. And actually, before starting this project, I use social media a lot. And after I start this project, I kind of become very cautious in terms of what I want to see on social media, especially publicly. And recently, I kind of like regained this part of the participation by being very active on Twitter as well. So you will see why am I moving up. So, and I want to talk about the motivation of this research, and especially, I think in the past like 5-10 years, we gradually realized that social media is very useful to energize and mobilize people, especially when we have a certain social cause that needs a lot, kind of like a mass support from citizens in one country or even cross-country internationally, right? Like what we see is the recent, I don't want to get into the topic too much, the recent civil unrest in several countries, and we see that social media is a very useful tool in terms of really value the support. And from the industrial relations study, the scholars has, I think in past almost 2 decades, 3 decades, to argue that labor movement could benefit from using new information communication technologies, the ICTs. And in the past decade, many people start talking about, yes, unions and organizers, we should use social media as a way to really communicate with people, both within the membership, but also outside the union organization. So far, the majority of the study rely on case studies or user member surveys to evaluate the potential gains of social media communication by the labor kind of movement. And I think in a way that those studies provide valuable snapshots of union social media strategies and member reactions, but we need to understand more to unfold why, or the potential pro and cons for utilizing social media communication. So, because I try to be brief, the slides doesn't really reflect to all those references and literatures, but I just want to give you a brief explanation in terms of how literature has been progressed in especially the industrial relations field. Social media and communication can strengthen and expand the benefit side, they can strengthen and expand networks within and beyond the workplace. So they can facilitate discussions among members, create a collective identity, and force collaborations with civil society organizations and the grassroots movement. They can also broaden unions' ideology and actions to the general public. They can reach a a much broader audience because they utilize the public forum. They can also lead online discussion and influence public opinion, and particularly gauge public support. So I have another kind of like a research project that recently published in BJIR. When me and my co-authors, we studied the impact of social media and communication during the Fight for 15 movement, right? This is one of the largest kind of like the most influential social movement that being pushed by social media and communication, in addition to the on-ground effort by the labor organizers and grassroots movement and the civil society organizations. So in that particular study that we did find that, unions can benefit significantly from this kind of like approach, that being very innovative and being more kind of like open-minded and really kind of adapt into the utilization and of the social media. But on the flip side, we do find social medias have a kind of like embedded with possible risks. Social media is not a one-way communication channel, right? Like it's not like, TV broadcasts or newspapers. And people can actually interact with each other. And if they don't really like what you talked about, and they can disconnect and follow you. So it really has a lot of kind of like, a power struggle or control issues when union try to really kind of like push their message and push their ideas to the general public. And the message created and delivered by social media can be challenged by other users as well, right? Like, you can totally start a conversation and being argued and debated by different actors on social media as well. So union could also possibly lose their leadership positions when competing against other kind of organizations or entities on social media as well. They could, the members could perceive social media channels as an alternative way to grievance and voice their dissatisfactions in work-related issues, which undermines kind of like the union effectiveness in terms of supporting workers and helping workers to really address workplace injustice. So when we kind of like, really kind of looking into the effectiveness of social medias, and we really have to really weigh the pro and the cons, the good part, and then kind of like the dark side of social media. But what I find is in this kind of like, growing body of literature, we don't really spend a lot of time at this moment to look into the social media and connectiveness among trade unions, okay? Because if you start looking at social media, one of the important features of social media and communication is that the content generators need to build a support network. So information and communication can flow within the network and kind of like have this cascading and diffusing information, because, everyone understands how social media works, right? You have a group of followers, you have a group of friends, they can see what you posted. That's how you diffuse the information. But if you don't have a lot of followers or friends, it's just one man thing, right? Like there's no kind of like the impact of how communication or message or information or even influence and the power being kind of diffused and transcended through this network. And in my literature review so far, I found 2 papers that really start looking into the network parts about social media. So one paper looked into the network characteristics of Twitter discussion of labor start. I think like I'm pretty sure the participants, like, you guys are familiar with the website. And the researchers find that the related Twitter discussion exposed people in the US and in the UK to the worker struggle in the global south. But it made very limited contributions to the global connectiveness. So people think, oh, this is a channel for me to get informed, but yeah, that's pretty much what they do. And another study that recently published in BJR just plotted the network connections for the most active members among the 5 for 15 kind of movement. So it wasn't clear to me, what they try to justify in terms of adding this part of the discussion into their paper. And I was hoping to kind of like talk to their authors, when we run into each other sometimes and discuss more. But that really kind of motivated me to start looking into, what the network and how does this kind of impact the union organizing and the union renewal literature. And is this really something that we can learn about? What's the current stage and how can we improve down the road? I want to bring another kind of side of literature that really kind of, related to this particular project. And it's really about the interunion relationship, the dispute and the collaboration that has been studied in the industrial relations field. So I think most of the early research on interunion relationship focused on the rivalry and the competition among unions. So union rivalry has been considered as a wasting of resource and a disruptive solidarity. Although some scholars do argue, seeing that competitions could potentially increase unions' performance. And so far, the early kind of empirical evidence shows that interunion rivalries can create a prolonged bargaining process and cause plausible wage inflations and also restricted work practices and more strikes. So a lot of evidence on that. And in addition, in the, I would say, old days, not really so old, members rating between industrial and craft unions is common. And this rivalry has been around, I think, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so in the US, the Labor and Management Revolution Act of 1947 defined union writing as unfair labor practices. And actually, an interesting kind of a learning point for me, who's not born in this continent, is that before the AFL-CIO merged in 1955, the Unity Committee, who's kind of discussed the union merger of the Federation mergers, drawn up a non-reading agreement to avoid reading between unions affiliated with AFL or CIO as a mean, quote, and as a means to eliminate the barriers to further progress towards a united labor movement and, quote, an essential precursors to merger. So this is a kind of an interesting kind of a piece of knowledge that I learned during this research. And also I find similar clause appears in the Constitution of the Canadian Labour Congress, the CLC, a labor organization born from a similar mergers in 1956 in Canada. So the regulatory pressure and the internal coordinated effort by the large unions kind of decrease the internal inter-union dispute until the early 2000s, right? We understand this is unfair labor practice, we should not do it. For the sake of union solidarity and the labor movement, we should not do it. Okay, so, and although the unions in US, UK, and Canada are actively engaged in merger and affiliation building in this period, I would say in my kind of sense, and also the literature I scanned, the labor movement has never been kind of really united into one kind of solid movement in a sense, either domestically or transnationally. Okay, so, but in the union renewal literature, we always kind of perceive that union as an abstract concept. We see, we have the collaboration, we can do this, we can build a strategic partnership, we can work with our buddy unions, we can really push the policy agenda, so we can do a lot of stuff. But if we really look deep into the structure of inter-union relations, it's still kind of fragmented in a sense. So a lot of research has been kind of diving into this kind of questions to ask why we cannot achieve like a real solidarity. Why there's always kind of like, you know, mergers and affiliations. Sometimes like a merger didn't really go well. We have lots of failed cases, and an interesting kind of case also motivated this research is that in early 2018, the largest Canadian kind of like private sector union, Unifor, announced disaffiliations from the Canadian Labour Congress. Okay, the reason that they disaffiliated with the National Federation is that they tried to kind of like, you know, reach some union locals that represented by the U.S. labor, U.S. unions, U.S. trade unions. So like, but the CSC saying you can't do it, you know, even though those like U.S. unions are not like, you know, our own affiliated organizations, but you still cannot do it, right? Like, you know, this group of workers chose to be represented by the U.S. unions, like, you know, 20 years ago, they should remain the same. Like, you know, you can't really initiate this kind of a approach to talk to those folks and say, yeah, you should join our unions because we are Canadian unions and we represent similar interests. Okay, so that's kind of like also the part of the motivation of this research paper as well. And
can you sum up, please, Ting Ting? Thank
yes.
you.
So I want to show kind of like, you know, this the question is how can, you know, how the Twitter communication can be represented by, you know, is this really some kind of like, you know, I would say reflections of their on-ground communication or their on-ground relationship. So what I did is that I captured their kind of followership in July 2013, and I captured their relationship in July 2018 as well. And just for the sake of the time, and I want to kind of see that, you know, I use this case to showcase that the network has grown both in size and density over the 5 years, but the growth is moderate and they are connected, but it's still fragmented. If we have time to kind of go back to the discussion, the fragmentation is pretty much aligned based on their language and their occupation, okay, or industry. The social media is an experience good. We can see that, you know, you have to use it to really get the benefit from it. And it's a normal good. You have to have the resources, both like in terms of member size and in terms of financial resources and in terms of time commitment. But those on-ground kind of like, you know, resources are not define who you are as an active member on social media. Okay, so the example that we have is that if we see that the activeness of the higher ed kind of faculty associations, and we see them very active members, but they actually very small in terms of size and the resources on ground. Okay, but it does kind of like address who are the most followed or popular account on social media. So there's kind of connection, but this connection needs to be under kind of further explored. Okay, so I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great. Interesting. So please, Bradley, can you unmute yourself and then you can present your research. Let me tell you everyone what that is. Bradley Weinberg is an assistant professor at Queen's University, and he'll be speaking about crisis or catharsis, the impact of work stoppages on bargaining unit mortality. Do strikes cause death of unions? Okay, so I couldn't resist that. Okay, so go ahead, Bradley, and I'm sure that this will be very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. So I'm just gonna start my presentation. I uploaded all of my slides, but I have way too much text on those, so I'm just gonna speak to you guys so that you're not reading text while I'm talking, and then once I get into the charts and tables, then I'll kind of share my screen. So mainly the motivation for this study is kind of my ongoing research program and looking at the factors that contribute to either the preservation or dissolution of bargaining relationships, those being two sides of the same coin, kind of. And so this kind of directly comes from, I had an ILR review article earlier this year come out that examined the association of agreement settlement stage with dissolution. And in that study, I found that work stoppages correlated with a 53% increase in the likelihood of bargaining relationship dissolution above directly bargained agreements. There's some differences in how I came up with that estimate, and we can get into it in the chat if we want, but I'll continue on. And so, you know, I had this finding that work stoppages are bad for bargaining relationship preservation, but I also knew of some of the strike literature that, you know, which I'll get into shortly, kind of, you know, viewed strikes as having perhaps benefits to bargaining relationships. But in that study, I only could see whether a work stoppage was settled after, or an agreement was settled after a work stoppage. And so it was a binary variable which treats all not all work stoppages are created equal. And so I looked towards kind of the strike literature, particularly the strike outcome literature, and found that really there hasn't been much looking at strikes' effects on bargaining relationship preservation and, you know, and dissolution. There's been studies on does unionization lead to insolvency? Their strike outcome literature looks at wages, productivity, you know, the effect on shareholder prices for the company, but not on the actual relationship and whether or not it continues. It's almost assumed that the relationship will continue. And so really I wanted to look, is there heterogeneity in the associations of work stoppages with bargaining relationship preservation, dissolution? And so, so moving on to kind of the theory, you know, if we kind of think about the two main areas of strike theory, we can look at the kind of the economic literature on strikes, and we can kind of look at the behavioral literature on strikes, and some theory points in different directions. So the econ literature basically characterizes strikes as costly errors or mistakes. And you know, it doesn't really matter for my purposes whether that's due to asymmetric information or uncertainty or miscalculations and costs or benefits. But, you know, basically strikes are costly. They hurt shareholder. They could harm the viability of the company, of the firm, of the plant. And so we might expect then that strikes, both, you know, the occurrence, the size, the duration, could all positively correlate with the end of bargaining relationships. On the other hand, we also have the behavioral literature that, you know, the concept of attitudinal structuring coming out of Walton McCarthy and trying to influence the actual bonds of the relationship. And then building on that, the Walton McCarthy and Kutcher Gershenfeld, 1994 strategic negotiations, incorporating the escape strategy based on some very acrimonious work stoppages taking place in the 80s, in which companies sought to break or oust the union. But on the other hand, we could see, you know, in the theory, some reasons why we might expect it to decrease dissolution or increase preservation. So the econ literature also casts strikes as learning opportunities. And so, you know, it might improve the relationship by improving the experience of bargainers and being to avoid these kind of costly errors. In the behavioral literature, sometimes strikes have been, you know, John Goddard, 1992, strikes as collective voice, right? That it's actually an expression of discontent, which can then, you know, bring that to management's attention, can make changes to actually improve the relationship. Kern Siegel in 1954 characterized strikes as a safety valve for the cathartic release of discontent. And so perhaps, you know, there might be actual, you know, improvements to the relationship. Or we honestly could find no association, because as I just showed, we have differing directions, you know, theoretically. And so it could be just a wash, or also, you know, it's notoriously hard to sometimes to identify strike outcomes because the parties make adjustments. And so, you know, whereas a strike may have led to a dissolution, if the parties make adequate adjustments, they could stave off dissolution. Anyways, so the data that I used to try and get at this is the Ontario Ministry of Labor's Collective Bargaining Information Services database. And so basically this tracks collective agreements within bargaining relationships longitudinally. I'm going to focus in on private sector non-construction bargaining agreements that were settled in between 1985 and 2012. And I merged this data set with Employment and Social Development Canada's labor program's work stoppage data. So this is to get beyond my previous work in which I had to use just a binary variable treating all work stoppages as homogeneous, because this data is a little denser when it comes to work stoppages. So it's data on all work stoppages taking place in Canada of greater than 10 work days lost to person days lost. I'll obviously just focus on Ontario, and it includes information on the size, the duration, and the type of work stoppage. And then just to kind of show here, let me screen one. We'll just kind of bring this up. Okay, I don't, there, okay. We'll just kind of go through. Sorry, I had it on the right slide to begin with. Okay, and so just some kind of descriptive. As we all know, the incidence of strikes has been declining for many, many decades now. That has continued in the private sector of Ontario. The orange bars are bargaining rounds without a work stoppage. So this is all work stoppages, not just strikes. Those tiny gray bars are the bargaining rounds that involved a work stoppage. And that yellow line is the percentage of bargaining rounds with a work stoppage. So you can see there's a decline. There's some dips there in certain places, actually correlating quite closely to kind of some of the political parties that are in power. And some of the legislation that's passed by some of those political parties. And then my outcome variable, which is dissolutions. So this is showing the percentage of rounds that involve a dissolution. That's the black line. Aggregate numbers of rounds of bargaining without a dissolution being the red bars, the yellow bars being rounds of bargaining that resulted in a dissolution. So that kind of fluctuates, as you can see, between kind of 8 and 12 or 7 and 12% for most of the time. It dips off, but I think part of the reason is because some of those relationships that were settled at the end there, actually my data runs out, and so I don't have enough time to see whether or not a dissolution. So that's a little bit artificial. But moving forward, so I'm using a logistic regression, looking at whether a dissolution takes place. So my dependent variable is 1 if the relationship ends versus 0 otherwise. I define dissolution as a decertification, a plant closure, or there's some others, a voluntary termination, like a service contract termination, kind of as a catch-all. And so my kind of independent variables include in some a work stoppage dummy, but then I get into characteristics, type, size, duration. Those are my main variables of interest. Then unit characteristics, so the bargaining unit size, the change of an employment from the previous contract, the composition, whether it involves just full-time, part-time, a mix, the union that it's affiliated, the bargaining unit it's affiliated with, environmental factors, the government in power, the unemployment rate to try and capture kind of the economic environment, and then industry, region, and union effects. And so this is kind of the most basic regression that I used here. As you can see, just with a binary for work stoppage, I include these control variables throughout the next couple of slides, but I don't show them because basically they don't really change, because for the next couple of slides, I'll basically just be parsing that work stoppage variable up more and more finer. And so basically those I'll just leave to that. We can come back to this if people want to discuss kind of the controls. But as you can see here, just with a binary work stoppage, it correlates, these are odds ratios. So the incidence of a work stoppage correlates with a 10%, almost 11% increase in relationship dissolution, but this isn't statistically significant. It's just outside the bounds of the 10% range. But as I start to move forward again and kind of parsing those variables up a little more, so first, treating all work stoppages the same, so lockouts or strikes, and then looking at the size or the duration. Size is estimated to basically have no effect, whereas duration has a highly statistically significant effect in that for every additional day in the duration of a work stoppage, a 0.4% increase there's a correlation with a 0.4% increase in dissolution, which obviously that doesn't seem too big, but as strikes go on, that can add up. And then when we break it down then into strikes versus lockouts, as you can see, strikes at just as a binary, just treating all strikes as equal, tends not to significantly associate or appear to have much of an impact at all on dissolution, whereas lockouts have a quite large, so at this point, almost 57% increase in the likelihood of dissolution if a bargaining relationship experiences a lockout. First contract work stoppages, I treat a little differently. I can get into that when we talk. Basically, there's a theoretical and a technical reason for that. But so mainly what I'm looking at here in these kind of variables, my main variables of interest are the bargaining rounds of renewal agreements. And so then here I'm just focusing on strikes. And so when I parse strikes out into size and duration, duration does then become statistically significant and statistically significantly increases with each additional day of a work stoppage. I then wanted to see what it would look like, as time went on. So I implemented then a duration squared. So basically it's increasing with each additional day, but at a decreasing rate. But if you calculate at what point those cross, it's actually quite far. And so for the most part, it's just increasing as most work stoppages go on. And then I wanted to see if there was any differences based upon, a variation using dummy variables for duration. And the main reason being, again, because perhaps we could think back to the theory in that kind of short work stoppages might be that kind of cathartic release, that kind of safety valve. It doesn't entail maybe the same cost, or shouldn't entail the same cost as a longer work stoppage. Sometimes the parties prepare for work stoppages, and so there might be actually very little cost to it, but it still might have that effect of the workers, releasing their discontent, sharing their displeasure, putting forth those issues they really care about, bringing them to management's attention. And so as you can see, there does appear to be, or at least points in that direction, that there's a decrease in the likelihood of dissolution for short work stoppages. As we continue on, there's the distribution of work stoppages is very high at short work stoppages and then decreases. So as we go on longer and longer, there's less and less work stoppages to estimate from, which is some reason why I think we get into seeing insignificant results here. But then obviously, once you get into the really long ones, the outcome is sufficiently bad that that there's a highly statistically significantly and even perhaps highly statistically significant increase in dissolution. Lockouts varies. We see the same size doesn't matter. Duration is what appears to matter most when it comes to the correlation with dissolution. And when we break it out into dummy variables, as we might expect, given our estimate on the binary variable of it being really, really poor outcome in terms of relationship preservation or the likelihood of dissolution, it's all above 1, which entails an increase in the likelihood of dissolution. There's a little bit more in terms of statistical significance, which is a little bit shocking because like in terms of this period 1985 to 2012, lockouts represented only about 8% of work stoppages, and so I'm actually parsing it quite thin in doing this. There isn't a lot of lockouts taking place, and yet the effect is so large that it's still achieving statistical significance in some of the estimates. And so just to wrap up real quick, regarding dissolution, it appears that duration and type of work stoppage seems to matter and not so much size. I have a kind of a hypothesis as to why that might be, but we can get into that. I want to stress this is correlation, not causation, right? Obviously, what brought about the work stoppage could have been the plant, the firm is already in financial distress, and so that's going to make the likelihood of dissolution higher to begin with. Short strikes seem to associate with lesser dissolution, which perhaps points a little bit towards some of those behavioral explanations. Lockouts, though, are pretty uniformly correlate with greater dissolution. And so this is actually quite preliminary, and so in terms of next steps, and I welcome any constructive criticism or any suggestions, but developing a greater set of controls, perhaps drawing on some of that literature, looking at the effect of unionization on firm insolvency, might be able to pull some from that. And also, I treat the rounds of bargaining as independent draws. And so, but as I said, this data set actually is longitudinally in structure. And so kind of incorporating that longitudinal structure into the analysis, I think, is another avenue that perhaps should be explored. So I'll leave it at that so that we have time to get some questions in, hopefully. And thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope that the other panelists will feel like they can ask questions of one another, as well as having the larger group feel like they can ask questions. Please raise your hand. If you would like to ask a question, you can do that. I'd like to just start out by asking a question of you, Bradley.
Sure.
I'm not as familiar with Ontario labor law as I should be. Are there differences between, laws on replacement, permanent replacement, and things like that, different there in Ontario that might be affecting your results?
Yes.
And making them not as the same in the United States?
Yes, so there is no permanent replacement workers in Ontario. Ontario does allow temporary replacement workers, but all permanent employees who walk out on strike have the right to recall for 6 months. So there is definitely more protection for workers. The only caveat to that too, though, is from 1993 to 1995 in my data, when the New Democratic Party implemented legislation, there was actually a ban on temporary replacements during that period. So for sure, the protections afforded to striking workers is much greater than in the U.S. It's in some provinces, it's even more protective than in Ontario. Quebec, BC do not allow any temporary BC used to. Quebec doesn't, and I believe the federal jurisdiction has a law against professional strike breakers. But yeah, so it's more protective than in the U.S. is the short answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other questions? It looks like Alexander Colvin would like to ask. Go ahead.
Hi, Ting Ting. This is going a little off from the core of your presentation, but I was curious about to what degree there's been strategic use and shifts across social media. I was just looking at our own ILR school social media, and they had some demographics. So on Facebook, the median users are 25 to 30 or 4-year-old females. Instagram is 18 to 24-year-old females, and then Twitter is old men, basically. And that got me thinking as you were presenting, that in terms of unions and who you communicate and stuff, and you see some, I sort of anecdotally see some variation, with ones like the flight attendants, Sarah Nelson's a pretty amazing communicator on social media, and I just sort of wonder what you've seen in terms of the strategic use and the different platforms that the unions are using.
This is something that I try to dig deeper in this line of research project. I try to contact the unions and to figure out who's actually in charge of the social media and communication. The follow-up question is there any designated person in those unions to look after those social media accounts, and what kind of social media account that they actually actively manage. Right? I can take a snack peek through the channels that they post on their national website. Most of them, they use Twitter, most of them, they use Facebook, most of them, they use YouTube. But like Instagram is something that you see that probably only happened in the past years. And like, a couple of folks start talking about they're going to use TikTok because like, the new millennials, they're going to join the workforce. So there's a kind of like a slow movement, but when you kind of like try to really shake them saying like what exactly you are doing on that, a lot of them has no idea. So it really depends on who's the actual people that are doing those social media communication. So that's the part that I think a lot of people like it needs to union folks need to ask themselves, like, are they really kind of like invested in this? But of course, the first question is like, is there any kind of like return in terms of like invest on this, right? It's really kind of like change of mindset. And the other study that I look into is really the difference between civil society organization or grassroots movement and how they manage social media compared to our union folks, how they manage. We see a very different mentality. One is top down and the other is bottom up. So it's very different in terms of impact and the diffusion speed of social media in terms of message. So there are a lot of interesting stuff going on. Like my challenge is that I need to find the theoretical support to all those exploratory kind of study that I'm into. But thank you. It's a really great question.
So Jenny Park has a comment or question. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah. I have a question to Bradley and Assaf, both of them. The first, is there any, to Bradley first, is there any like a characteristic of the unions or the firms to have influence on the dissolution, or not on the size? There must be from the union side, there must be like a bargaining power, like wage or skill level, or from the company side, there must be a kind of revenue, not only the size, but the revenue, whatever things, or industry, whatever things, right?
Right. Yeah.
So variables you can consider.
So I do include, as I said, like an industry effect. I do include union affiliation, and for sure, I mean, I haven't dug too deep into those union dummy variables too much, but there certainly is variation in the likelihood of dissolution when it comes to different unions. And obviously for reasons you just said, and even others, you think, the different, if strikes really are harmful or helpful to bargaining relationship dissolution, then unions that are more militant or less militant, could potentially have an effect in that direction. Again, I don't have really anything. I do have a long-term goal of trying to implement denser data into this data set, including firm characteristics, union characteristics, but for the time being, I'm basically stuck with effects.
Assaf, do you have a comment?
Yeah, can I have another
answer?
question?
Jenny, go ahead. Jenny.
Okay, so I have another question to Assaf, and then I really enjoy your paper about the new actors of industrial relations, but at the same time, you may consider that another new actors, like international actors, because the globalizing era, especially the industry has been globalized so much, especially like, for example, through global supply chain in the garment industry or electronics, whatever other industries. So sometimes international actors like international opera brand or international trade unions or the foreign institute, like a foreign government, like a US government, especially, for example, in the US government in Cambodia, they played a really crucial role to build the industrial relations system, institutionalize industrial relations. So I don't know so much about the Palestine and the Israel case, but you may consider one, to do what is the global context or global factors may have influence on the new actors to play the role in this area, in the era of the globalization.
Thank you very much, Ginny. I cannot agree with you more. You're very right, but surprisingly, despite the fact that there is almost, it's a very big surprise, to be brief, that international actors took very, very little space or place in the enforcement or the improvement of workers' representation, in contrast to other countries, other mainly Eastern Asian countries. Michelle Ford just published a great book about it, by the way, which emphasizes the role of international actors. But in Israel-Palestine, international actors take very, very marginal place concerning workers' rights. They do regulate migration, and in the context of non-citizen Palestinians, they do criticize mainly governmental policies toward freedom of movement of workers. Nonetheless, concerning the enforcement of rights, Israeli-based civil society organizations are really the most influential motivators of transformations in the enforcement, in workers' representation, in workers' power, if you want. But thank you very much.
Well, I noticed that actually our time is up. And so thank you all very much. And it was a small session, but a good one. And I really want to thank our participants and also the audience. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Paula.
Great. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Great jobs.
Thanks, Alex.